This is probably one of the best essays I've written on the internet all week. This is by David Dennison on Substack, and it's titled Why Your Son is Right Wing. The author is a millennial teacher, and he's also a father of a son. So he has had a front row view of what has happened to Gen Z over the last decade, and he makes a really compelling case why Democrats have lost the plot and why young men are increasingly becoming more and more conservative. I don't think that his answers will surprise you. I think this will make sense to a lot of people, but I think he's really highlighted that damage has been done, and it's probably going to take another decade, or not a decade, I'm sorry, a generation to undo what has been done. And so I think this is really shows there's a nail in the coffin for Democrats, and there is no recovering from this. So he opens it up talking about how his earliest childhood memory, political childhood memory, was in his early years, so about 8 years old. And so this is a reference point he uses throughout the piece. I mean, for me, I'm a millennial too. I'm a little bit younger than him, but for me, like, 9/11 was definitely a pivotal moment. I think everyone can agree. And I was a week shy of my 10th birthday when 9/11 happened. So I was around, right? I remember like Y2K and things like that. But really things crystallized for me starting with 9/11. And I think the same is probably true for others my age as well. And so he opens this up saying, we tend to talk about partisan swings in terms of shifting preferences. The observation that young voters, men especially, have been trending Republican for at least 5 years is treated as a PR problem for the Democrats. The general belief is that something has tempted these youngins to the dark side, and putting things right requires our finding the magic words to lure them back to the light. And this is absolutely true. This is why the Democrats have allocated $20 million, and they're hiring all sorts of consultants and convening in strategy sessions and hotel ballrooms, trying to figure out how to talk to young men. They think they need to find their version of Joe Rogan without realizing that they had a Joe Rogan. His name was Joe Rogan, and like so many other Democrats or former Democrats, the party alienated all these people, myself included. So it's not a PR problem. It's something much more perverse than that. And so one of the things he brings up, and I think this is really relevant, is that we treat generational cohorts like they're a fixed group of people with unfixed opinions. And he says here, every year we graduate our 29s, so 29-year-olds becoming 30-year-olds into the older bracket, and we welcome new 18-year-olds into the fold. So what has happened over the last decade is basically millennials have aged out of young adult status. We're now like, I don't know, mid-adult. We're all in our 30s into 40s right now. So obviously our politics have changed because we've gotten older and taken on new roles in life. But we're no longer, the 18 to 29-year-old cohort. And so Gen Z has grown up and aged into that cohort. And unlike previous generations, they have brought a new, entirely different political philosophy with them. So, in the past, you could reliably expect a lot of young people to be far more liberal. And then the saying always goes, like, once you turn 30, you start becoming more conservative. I mean, this was definitely true for me. It may have been true for you. I think that's in part due to just lifestyle changes, right? Like, you get married, you have kids, you buy a home, your priorities change. And so suddenly, like, your interests change. Like, when I was 20, like, screaming at me that abortion was a privilege I needed to protect, and if I didn't, I was going to lose reproductive health care. Like, that resonated with 23-year-old feminist Amanda far more than it does 34-year-old Amanda. Now my views have completely changed, and I see abortion is morally bankrupt, and I don't think it's a privilege, and I don't think it's healthcare, right? And so my views on that have obviously changed. And so I think as people get older, naturally the views have changed. The problem that the Democratic Party is facing is that it's these younger 18 to 29-year-old guys who are skewing more conservative than in generations past. And so the Democrats are running around trying to figure out why that's happening. He says here, if 8-year-olds just to use my personal example, is around the time political sentience awakens. So the time, you start having awareness and memories about the political world around you. That means that today's youngest voters were first learning what politics was just as woke was getting into full swing, which is to say the opinions they have brought with them into adulthood were all forged in one of the most bizarre cultural crucibles the modern era has ever known. And so to give you context of what this looks like, Gen Z, their age cohort is about 1997 to 2012. And so they would have hit age 8 beginning in 2005 and going up through 2020. So that means the oldest Gen Zers would have started high school around 2011. And that would make sense, because that is when a lot of the woke stuff started. Like, I have no memory of woke, and like the whole woke stuff is frankly kind of unsettling to me, because I've been trying to rack my brain and go back in time to figure out if this stuff had come up, and I was just like completely unaware of it. And there were some things that did come up in college, right? Like, I wasn't necessarily handed feminism on a silver platter and told to believe it, but I had teachers and professors around me who were feminists, and they passed their beliefs on to me, and were very much girl power. I learned multiculturalism, and that we were citizens of the world. I was also an international relations major, so that might have had something to do with it. But like the whole white privilege stuff, like I have no memory. Like the first time I really heard about that was in 2020 with George Floyd. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. And I, like so many people, like saw what was happening and felt like, oh my gosh, did I do something wrong? I rushed out and bought 2 books, The Color of Law, and then Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. I bought them for Kindle, immediately sat down and tried to educate myself, as everyone was telling us to do. And I got through the first chapter of Ibram X. Kendi's book, and I could not continue reading it, because all like his definitions were just completely out of left field. And he wasn't just talking about how to not be a racist and like how to respect yourself. Like, there was visceral anti-white hatred in that. So I couldn't compel myself to continue reading a book that called me an evil white racist. And so I, as an adult in 2020, can make that decision. But if you're a child, if you're going through the public school system and you're just handed this stuff and your teachers are telling you this stuff, like you're not of your own agency to make choices and decisions for yourself. You're being spoon-fed and told what to believe. And so this is what he's saying here. It's that woke was kicking off just as young men were starting to grow up and become aware of the world around them. They were in the school system. And then because the school system is where a lot of this was happening, was being passed down and transmitted to young people, that's where they started picking this stuff up. And so during this period of time, those considered marginalized among this cohort were taught that they belonged to a multi-century legacy of hopeless victim, and they were taught exactly whose fault that was. So Black people, people of color, they were taught that the white man had destroyed everything and ruined everything, and it was up to them to take what is theirs. And you see this language all over the place today. Leftist, white liberal women profess it. Angry Black women on TikTok profess it. Like this language is very much mainstream today, in which it wasn't a decade ago. And then he says those considered privileged, so white men, were treated to what really amounts to an entire childhood's worth of side-eye, suspicion, and blame for crimes committed before even their oldest relatives were conceived. So basically being told that you are basically holding onto a social debt for the crimes committed of your ancestors. And it didn't even matter, to be honest, and this is what's like the wild part about this, it didn't even matter if your ancestors were even here. A lot of people forget this, but the vast majority of people living in the United States today are truly immigrants. They came during the first and second wave of European immigration in the mid 19th century and into the early 20th century. And then obviously more recent waves of immigration. They weren't here for the Civil War. Their ancestors weren't here during the Revolution, and they weren't here during the founding of the colonies when slavery was introduced. It's a very small number of people. And, I'm really proud of the fact that, like, my ancestry does extend that far. So I'm a 15th generation American. My family came to New York and Pennsylvania colonies in the 1600s. But they were farmers, right? They were poor farmers. We didn't have slaves. And my mother's side of the family were German. And so I don't have documentation to prove this, but I suspect because of that period of time, typically those who came from Germany in the 1600s were indentured servants. I strongly suspect that my mother's side of the family was probably here in a state of indentured servitude. So there is no crimes and no penance for my family tree to pay up. We've been, working the land and doing the thing here for generations now. And so when we talk about even the crimes of the past, we're talking about a minority of a minority of a minority of people, not even, the majority. And oh, by the way, slavery was introduced by a Dutch ship that came to Jamestown in the 1600s in 1619. It wasn't even the British. I mean, obviously over time, British settlers brought slaves with them, and wealthy plantation owners institutionalized it and became the economy of the South. But it wasn't even like the original people who founded this country, the Puritans and the original founders. They weren't just like crazy evil white racists who were bringing slaves with them. Like it's something that evolved over time, and we've come to terms with it and fought a war over it, and here we are today. But to expect kids, Gen Zers, to pay for those crimes is just absolutely absurd. And that's basically what's been happening for the last decade. Okay, so he says, there's a reason we hold bigotry in disfavor, even when its most harmful expressions are prohibited by our laws. Communicating even subtly to entire groups of people that they are unwelcome, unwanted, or untrustworthy cannot help but alter how members of those groups see themselves. Of course, like white men have experienced this for years, but it's been especially pernicious among young boys over the last decade. Within full view and earshot of them, we separated children along the boundaries of moral righteousness. Emphasis here on children. Like it's up to us, the adults, to steward them and shepherd them into adulthood. And we've basically, and he makes the case here that we've basically abused them over the last decade by indoctrinating them with this ideology. He says kids from the unduly privileged groups were going to grow up seeing on TV, online, at the movies, at school, at church, at home, everywhere, that they were fundamentally unsafe for members of other, more innocent groups to be around. Their ancestors and predecessors had seen to that, boasting such a bad track record that they should expect different, harsher standards to be applied to their lives, probably also a degree of social exclusion and limitation. They should expect it to be harder for them to enter the workforce, harder for them to climb social and professional ladders, and harder for their contributions to be recognized or celebrated. And not only should they refrain from complaining about any of this, they should be thankful, actually. So they've grown up knowing that they have a penance to pay for crimes they didn't commit. And this is just like when you're a child, you just accept this. Like you can't push back. And the thing is, these kids have eventually grown up. The kids who were 8 years old in 2005 are young adults today. They're in the workforce. They are struggling. And so they're pushing back. And this is why you're seeing more and more young Gen Z men siding with the right, becoming more conservative. It's because they are pushing back against what they were taught as children. Their willingness to forfeit their respect and prosperity was a morally necessary act of penance. Their sacrifice would help balance the cosmic ledger. When would it finally be balanced? Oh, probably not in their lifetime or their kids' lifetime, or perhaps even their kids' lifetime. What people don't understand, and this is why I take so much offense to this whole woke ideology, is that this is a deliberately designed social debt that is never intended to be repaid. It cannot be repaid. The only way, in theory, that you could repay a debt in kind like this would be to subjugate and enslave the people who participated in slavery and were the slavers of the past. So it would be to square the circle and make everything right, you would have to enslave white people. And this is why you see a lot of genocidal language within these conversations coming from the left. It's not even just racist anymore. Like there is inherent genocidal language where there is a strong desire to erase white people because of the sins of the past. So this debt is not one that is intended to ever be repaid. The only way to repay it would be to erase the progeny of those who committed these acts in the first place. And that's where we're at. And that, yeah, I'm with these guys. Like, we got to push back against that. That is abhorrent. Okay, he says, consider the political dimensions here. One of our two great parties followed around the plurality of American youth with a megaphone, screaming at them all throughout their formative years that they were greedy and wicked and needed to obediently queue up for a lifetime of quiet atonement. Was it really surprising that upon maturation they chose to vote for the other party? No, absolutely not. And again, this is why you're seeing what you're seeing happen right now with the shift in politics, and why Democrats have lost young men, and they're not going to get them back. An 18-year-old white man today was 8 years old when woke kicked off in 2015. So this young man, grew up with all of this, right through elementary school, middle school, high school, is now in the real world, college, working, whatever. And this is the reality he has to deal with, and he's pushing back. Such an 18-year-old had his entire childhood dominated by an ideology that favored every conceivable identity group over his own, well before he possessed the intellectual tools to push back or defend himself. He was instructed that his intentional marginalization was right and natural because simply for being born as he was to the parents he was liable for a privilege he could never hope to pay off, even if he lived several lifetimes. And because this privilege is incumbent on who you are, it's based on the color of your skin, it's based on your gender, it truly is something you cannot pay back. And I have a theory. I don't know if this is true. I suspect this might be the case. I think this is why when you look at like the trans issue right now, you see far more vitriol, and conversations are far more dominated with young men transitioning to women versus young women transitioning to men. And I'm not saying that it's not happening on both sides, because there definitely are young girls who are being groomed and conditioned to believe that they live in the wrong body, and the only way to fix that problem is to become a man. But I think you're seeing a lot, at least, I don't know if it's quantitatively, but at least in the press and in conversations in culture and society, you're seeing it dominated by young men transitioning to women. And I think that's because they cannot absolve themselves of the guilt of their whiteness and of their manhood. Therefore, the only thing they can do is to erase it. You can't make yourself black. I mean, people have tried and it doesn't work. So the only option you have to pay your penance is to literally erase your manhood by becoming a woman. And I suspect this might be happening more than people are acknowledging. Okay, so he pulls up a Manhattan Institute survey that was done. It was done in 2022, and it was for 1,500 recent high school grads. 82% of them were from public schools, and they were asked if they'd encountered a series of 6 woke-coded ideas while at school. For all 6, a majority had learned about the concept entirely directly from a teacher or from another adult at school. And so this talks to how indoctrination is happening in the schools, and how schools were the first to be captured, and this is how these beliefs have been passed down. So the 6 beliefs are: America is a systemically racist country. In America, white people have white privilege. In America, white people have unconscious biases that negatively affect non-white people. America is built on stolen land. America is a patriarchal society. Gender is an identity choice, regardless of the biological sex you were born into. I'll say, again, I was in high school. Well, so like I said, 9/11 was my formative year. So I was just about to turn 10 years old. And then, so I would have been in high school from 2005 to 2009. And so none of this came up when I was a teenager. I had never heard of any of this. Like I said, the first time, I had started hearing things about white privilege maybe in 2018, 2019. That's when intersectionality started making its way into feminist conversations, which I was a part of. So I became aware of it like that. I still thought it was a fringe thing. And then obviously George Floyd 2020, that's when the lid came off and everyone was worried about their white privilege. But this was not stuff that was talked about in public school in the 2000s. No one talked about this. If you had told a 15 or 16-year-old version of me that 2 decades later we would be having conversations about gender being an identity choice, I would have thought you were high off your rocker. There was no concept of that in the 2000s. And there was no way that would have ever become a thing. Like that is just such a left field idea. Now, obviously, it's become so normalized and politically divisive. It's just absolutely astounding. So he says, I'm 41. I paid attention in class. None of this shit was on the curriculum when I was growing up. And again, like, same. I'm 34. None of this was on the curriculum. And I think it's because the things that dominated our formative years were 9/11 and the 2008 financial crisis. And so that's how my politics was shaped. And I would definitely say, I grew up in a conservative evangelical household, not like super conservative. My dad would watch Fox News. I'd go to church, 2-3 times a week. But I began identifying as a liberal, I think, in response to the neocons with how they handled 9/11, right? Like, I vividly remember 9/11. I vividly remember watching the bombing of Baghdad on my TV on CNN when I was, in 2003, when I was like, 12 years old? Like, I vividly remember picking up the newspaper and reading about Fallujah and reading about Abu Ghraib and reading about Guantanamo Bay. And like, you saw this in the media too, like all the movies of this period of time, if you go back, like a lot of it are war movies and they're very violent. And so that is like the world I grew up in. And so once like I became aware of the fact that, they had lied. They lied about Saddam Hussein. They misrepresented what happened. Like, naturally, I began to move away from the Republican Party because they had a stain on their record, right? Like, who wants to support war criminals? And that's exactly, looking back, like that's what happened. Like, Colin Powell went to the United Nations and lied to the world that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And we all know now that was an utter fabrication. And so how do you support a political party that does that? Well, when I came of age and was able to vote, like I couldn't. Barack Obama was this new guy, charismatic, first African-American president. Like, of course, I got behind him and, that seemed natural. But for young people today, like the conversation has been totally different. They've been taught to hate themselves. And so, of course, they're reacting in much the same way, I did and people my generation did, but they're reacting in a very, going back more conservative. So he says here, little Billy, first grader, is not your racist uncle at Thanksgiving. And he's not the guy in the cubicle next to you guffawing at 4chan. Little Billy and his friends probably do not need to have their white privilege wrung out of them, or for their classmates to regard them as guilty or inflicting generational trauma on everyone else. And this is why he says this, and I think it's true, like this is child abuse. We have robbed children of their childhoods by imposing sex education to kindergartners, by requiring 10-year-olds to choose their gender identity, by telling white kids that they're evil and awful, and like he says here, just as bad as your racist uncle at Thanksgiving. And it's not the same. Like, kids just want to be kids, And yeah, they might do things, and you might make it might seem like they're being preferential, but that's not always entirely the case. Like, kids aren't just inherently these evil racists, right? They might not like a certain kid because that kid might do something mean to them, and that kid also might be of a certain color or background or whatever, right? And so there's some pattern recognition that kids start making from a pretty early age. So that could be part of it too. It's not necessarily that kids are just evil and they're programmed with racism and it has to be ripped out of them. We're the ones doing this to them. And even if we think that divisive identitarianism is limited to online spaces, which it is not, it would still be a problem that kids whose prefrontal cortices are 20 years away from full development are getting force-fed an endlessly repeating message that their sex and skin tone make them better or worse than others around them. So he's saying here, like, kids are increasingly online and young age. So this gets to like the adolescence series that was on Netflix and talking about how the manosphere and internet culture is shaping how young men think. So that's sure, like they're being exposed to some of this stuff online. But he says even then, like that's not entirely the cause of this. It's not because you have 8-year-olds listening to Andrew Tate. It's because you have 8-year-olds being told that they're evil white racists, and then they become 15, 16-year-olds, start listening to Andrew Tate, and he starts to help them make sense of what they've already been witnessing. So by the time they are adults, they're completely done with this. Like, they have agency now to make their own choices. So that's exactly what they're doing. He says, but then for Gen Z, we decided, okay, let me come back, because he says, for millennials, actual anti-racism, opposing racism by or against anyone was the order of the day. Racial prejudice was for the outdated and the unenlightened. Sexism was described to us as a sad relic of a bygone era. Yeah, I mean, that's how I remember things too. Like, racism wasn't an issue because if you were a racist, like, you were like unenlightened, uneducated, like you were not a bad person, but you were just like socially inferior, if that's the way to put it. Like, you just haven't been educated. And so like even today, when I think of racists, I'm not thinking about corporate executives sitting in a boardroom somewhere. Like, the image of a racist that comes into my head immediately is some dude in like a holler somewhere, a big, large dude wearing overalls, a beard, probably smoking a pipe with a Confederate flag in the background, like a hillbilly, like a literal hillbilly. Like, that's when I think of racism, like, that is the image that comes into my mind. Not like corporate white collar people, not average everyday people. And I think that is true for most people. I think most people aren't racist. Most people a lot of people might, again, look at pattern recognition and make certain decisions based on that. And I don't think that's entirely wrong. But most people are not like inherently racist. They're not like that. So he describes millennials like that, and he says, but then for Gen Z, we decided that actually those evils were still totally with us. They explained everything, and the only way to even things out was to grab the heirs of unearned privilege by the ankles and drag them under. And then something happened. They all grew up. So there was a decision by the adults in the room in our educational institutions that no, racism was actually a problem, and that the kids needed to be educated in the crimes that their ancestors had committed, and they needed to pay penance for it. And frankly, I don't know like where this switch came from. Like, was it Gen X teachers that started implementing this? Like, I don't know like where this started coming from. I know people talk about like critical race theory and that kind of thing, but it takes a while for ideas incubated in academia to transfer down to schools, right? And because teachers, you have to get your bachelor's and your master's, and you have to do all sorts of like requirements. So it's not like anyone can become a teacher. So these ideas were transmitted in universities where teachers were getting credentialed, but I don't quite know like the point in time when this started happening. I know like gender stuff started really kicking off in like the 2000s. So was this, I'm wondering, like, was this a younger cohort of teachers who were just entering into their careers in the early 2010s, and the older generation had like started retiring out, and so you had a replacement of more newer teachers with woke ideology, female teachers predominantly. Like is that what the catalyst was for this, and is that how it started to really manifest? That would be something I'd be curious to see more information about, to see how that shift happens, because it's clear it happened in the schools, and this is where a lot of this started. But I'm curious to know the demographic shift that happened amongst teachers to make it possible for this to really kick off. Okay. So he talks now about the Democrats having their bizarrely difficult time understanding what these voting trends are actually telling us about the electorate. So the fact that young men are skewing more and more conservative. They've just spent $20 million to study young men in the hopes that they can understand and reverse their rightward drift. And so the narrative amongst Democrats, or the assumptions that they're making about what that problem is, goes like this. Young men were left-wing 10 years ago, so millennial men were left-wing. Now Gen Z men are right-wing, so a generational cohort has changed, which the Democrats neglect to acknowledge. And this generational cohort grew up in completely different political circumstances. Ergo, somebody, Theo Vaughn, Andrew Tate, hypnotized them, so they believe the new media environment, the uncontrolled media environment of podcasts and social media, is like waving some magic wand and saying magic words and convincing these young men to become conservatives. And so therefore the conclusion is, we must seize this magic for ourselves so that they may be re-hypnotized back into the fold. And that would explain why they're spending so much money studying young men trying to recreate Joe Rogan for themselves. And he says here, Joe Rogan did not trap a bunch of 18-year-olds in stasis, poison them with right-wing ideas like that, checks notes, Bernie Sanders was a good choice for president, and then release them to answer Gallup surveys 10 years later as the same vernal youngsters. What actually happened, of course, was that a bunch of boys grew up to become voting age. Like they weren't indoctrinated by Joe Rogan. Like I've listened to Joe Rogan. I'm a big fan of his. I think a lot of you probably are too. Like he has interesting guests on, interesting conversations. He is far from conservative. Like certain things he has opinions on. Yeah, sure. But like you listen to some of the stuff he talks about, he is a far more centrist and I would say like liberal leaning person, not uppercase big L liberal like we see today, but someone who has more progressive values compared to, you know, your hardcore conservatives. Like Joe Rogan is no Matt Walsh. And so if these people think that like this is what's happening, like they're completely off base. He says, we trapped these kids in an ideological straitjacket against which they were not allowed to resist, against which resisting made them evil. Then we gasped in horror when they aged out of our stewardship and decided that actually they'd had rather enough of all of that. And this is what's happened. And so he concludes here by saying, like, look, he's a father. He has a son. He doesn't want his sons to necessarily grow up voting for people like Donald Trump or listening to people like Andrew Tate. He wants them to be able to think for themselves. But not to exist in a culture where they feel victimized, marginalized, or despised. And I think anyone with young boys right now is thinking the same thing. Like they're seeing what has been done and how young men are being treated. And unless you're a crazy leftist liberal, I can't think of a single parent who willingly wants to send their sons into the gauntlet and have them grow up to hate themselves, feel like they have to sacrifice their manhood on the altar of feminism, and that they're not allowed to have opportunities just because they're white men or men in general. It's not even just white men who feel disaffected. Like men in general are feeling this too. And so I think this essay does a really good job encapsulating what has happened, because this isn't just a static problem. Like Gen Z is still aging. I think the youngest Gen Zers are 13. So this is a generational problem. So this isn't going to be something the Democratic Party can fix anytime soon. This is an existential crisis for them. And the only way that they're going to be able to continue retaining power is to continue, pandering to feminist women. So long as there's still a feminist base, like they will have that. Continue pandering to minority views and upholding those. And then, of course, importing illegal migrants or continuing to dole out benefits to folks on welfare programs. Like that is the only way they're going to continue to maintain a base. But as of right now, like they are not going to maintain a base. Like there are no self-respecting young men who can be Democrats. And I've written about this and I've talked about this. You cannot be a young man and respect yourself in today's society and also be a Democrat, because the tenets of the ideology of which the Democratic Party currently espouses requires you to surrender your manhood on the altar of that ideology, and no self-respecting man should do that. And so it is a zero-sum game. And then, of course, like Democrats have their own a further existential problem, because okay, if your base is largely marginalized, disenfranchised people, specifically I'm thinking of the LGBTQ community and trans people, okay, they're not necessarily repopulating the earth in large numbers. And then feminists who equally hate themselves, they're not repopulating in large numbers either. So the only path for longevity for the Democratic Party is to import people, so import migrants, or continuing to encourage welfare queens to pop out children and be baby factories, which a lot of them are doing. Like, that's realistically the only long game that the Democrats have, which is terrible to think about. And so they are rightfully concerned. I don't think there's any path forward for the Democratic Party, and unfortunately, I think that means what base they have is, I think, it's going to become further and further and more radicalized in response to what is happening to the conservative pushback that is growing. I mean, you're seeing right now with the government shutdowns, right? Like, the Democrats were like, oh, we'll capitalize on this. This will be a win. No, like, poll numbers continue to show favorability among Democrats sliding. Like, Republicans are picking up support, not necessarily because people like Republicans or like what the conservative movement has to offer, but it's a better alternative to what the Democrats are offering. So a lot of people are going with it right now, and especially young men. And so I like I said, this is a really fantastic essay, really well written. And I think he offers some insights as a millennial, as a teacher, and as a father of a young son. I think he has some really good takes here. So I'll link this below if you want to read it for yourself. But I appreciate you for watching this. I would love to know if you resonate with this, especially if you're a Gen Zer and you grew up being indoctrinated. If you care to share what that experience was like, I think that would help educate a lot of older people, because, like I said, a lot of us don't really resonate with it, because this was a completely different paradigm when we were in school. And like, for myself, like, I can't resonate with what my grandparents went through when they were in high school, right? In the 40s and 50s, because that was a completely different world. So if you have some insights into like what happened to you in high school and how that shaped who you are today and your political choices, definitely share some thoughts in the comments below. Appreciate you for watching. Love to hear your thoughts. If you like this, definitely like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.